Okay, thank you so much, Dawn. That was a really great introduction. Not a lot of people are aware of the cost of extreme weather. So how you covered that is great. Clearly, you're really following the news. I think a lot of people follow the news in a different way. That doesn't include our team at the Intact Center. We're very much like reading the Globe and Mail, the Star, the National Post, like all the major media, CBC. But a lot of people just get their news from social media, so they're not aware of like those costs, for example, that come with extreme weather or with climate change. So there's a completely different view around climate change, and people are just not aware of how much it's taking out of their own pockets. So we'll cover that today with this presentation. I'll talk a little bit about what we do at the Intact Center. I changed the order of my title a little bit, from climate strategies for communities first, then individuals, and then insurance. So it's really important to understand that with extreme weather and climate change, any sort of solution, we're really looking at the landscape level first. So unless our communities are really doing as much as they can to lower their risk by implementing like flood mitigation measures, then not much will change for the individuals. But of course, individuals have a lot to do here, and insurance has a big responsibility in this area, because of course they want to reduce risk in the system. So risk costs them a lot of money, and it means raising premiums and possibly losing customers. So the insurance sector is particularly keen on removing that risk out of the system. So as Dawn mentioned, I work at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. I thought I'd do a little introduction on who we are. There's a bit of confusion sometimes, and people think that we are Intact Financial. Intact Financial gives a gift to the University of Waterloo as a donation, and that donation comes to our center. And so through our center, we do applied research that's national in focus. So today I'll speak a little bit more to what's happening maybe in Hamilton and what can be applied in Hamilton. But Hamilton is a city similar to others across Canada. So much of the work that we do can be applied to different cities. And what we do is focus on wildfire, flooding, and extreme heat, and really focus on how to use nature-based solutions to lower our risk. We produce easy-to-follow, actionable guidance. So you won't see our work in a peer-reviewed journal. We have lots of other great professors and researchers at the University of Waterloo that do that. Our institute really focuses on creating guidance and tools that can be used. So whether you're an individual, so a resident, government, a business, anybody should be able to use our tools to reduce their risk to these climate hazards. We approach this in a whole of society way. So just as I said, like it's a community level response. That's where we want to start with reducing our risk. It's a whole of society approach. So insurance, industry, banks, the government, individuals, everybody needs to be part of the solution. Just as much for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation, as much as making our communities more resilient. Everybody's going to have to take a part in this. We address climate adaptation. So I just mentioned mitigation. Mitigation is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions or removing them from the atmosphere to slow down climate change. But on the other side is adaptation. So adapting to the impacts that we're already experiencing. As Dawn mentioned, there are just hundreds of events occurring, and they're increasing every year. So we used to have just a few extreme weather events in Canada in the 80s, and it's really gone up to having like anywhere near like 100 or more per year that are happening in our country, and of course globally that number has only gone up. So we need to adapt to climate change. So both things need to happen together. We need to mitigate as well as adapt so that we don't lose lives and we don't lose our properties and our homes and our cities. And we really focus on knowledge mobilization. So something like this today is just perfect for us. We really want to reach people, let them know the tools exist. We hear that there's climate anxiety or these feelings that there's not much that you can do. The problem is so complex and so much bigger than you. The good part about adaptation is that there's so much that can be done. We have the tools, we have the resources, implementing them is the next step. So we'll really get to that today. And I know there is a Q&A section when I'm done my presentation, but feel free to interrupt. I might not see if you put a hand up, and I'm happy to answer questions. I've taught courses before, and I think that's a great way to have a back and forth and a conversation here. So please feel free to just interrupt and ask away. So today, what I really want to cover is first just talk about extreme weather. Why is it on the rise, and costs are on the rise as well, which again, Dawn mentioned this, I just mentioned it a little bit, but we'll see a graph about this. And then we're going to really focus on flooding. So we do a lot of work on extreme heat and wildfire at the Intech Center, but today we're focusing on flooding, but I just want to mention especially extreme heat. The city of Hamilton is actually at higher risk of extreme heat events occurring. It is projected that by the end of the century, or not even the end, but like about 2080, there will be about 30 more days, I believe, of extreme heat occurring in the city. So just as a heads up, if that's another subject you'd like to cover in the future, extreme heat is a big one, especially for our urban centers. But today we'll focus on flooding, which is the most common impact across Canada, and it's the costliest climate hazard for residents. And then we'll get into the resources that we produce at the Intech Center. And again, I'll go from community level protection to a home flood level protection or individual level protection, and then get into what insurers should be doing and could be doing. So we have a lot of reports that tell us a lot of things, and this is Canada's latest climate change report. It's actually being updated now, so this one's from 2019. There's one of my colleagues is actually working on the new one with the Government of Canada, which should be released next year. But really, this report is similar to the IPCC's assessment, which are all in agreement. One, climate change is happening. I know I don't need to convince this group about that, but also really talks about how that climate change is impacting Canada. And so since 1948, the average temperature in Canada has already risen by about 2 degrees Celsius, and that's on average. So 2024, as we've heard in the news, was the hottest year on record globally, and we passed that threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So globally, that's a major concern. We're above the average. In Canada, we have been above the average for a long time, and we have passed that threshold for a long time. Our country warms faster than the rest of the world, and the northern region warms about 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the world. This is due to several reasons, but one of them is just the snow melting. There's more permafrost exposure. Permafrost releases a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere when it melts. And as it becomes exposed, those sun rays just stop bouncing back and become more absorbed. And just the sheer land mass that we have so much land when you look at the northern hemisphere compared to the southern hemisphere, that we're just feeling that warming much quicker than the rest of the world. So with that warming, we have more frequent and severe extreme weather events. This happens for many reasons, but it's based on a curve where you have your what's commonly happening, and then as that curve moves, our extremes move as well. So for example, when it comes to flooding, a warmer atmosphere can hold much more moisture. So when we have a rain event occur and we have a warmer atmosphere, a lot more water falls. So extreme rainfall events are becoming more common and can occur anywhere across Canada. I'll touch again on that a little bit later. And then, apart from trying to slow down climate change, we really need to adapt to the impact now. What's important about that, and it seems alarmist, but even if we were to stop all of our emissions today, all of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere wouldn't just go away that same day. They stick around, unfortunately, for possibly centuries. I'm hopeful it would be less than that. Scientists are making a major mistake, and if we stopped everything, there would be less of that time in our atmosphere, but it seems that that's how long they would stay in the atmosphere, which means the impact that we're feeling from what we've already done with climate change would continue to be felt, even if we did our absolute best to slow that down. It would take a while for us to really see those effects decrease. So we need to adapt no matter what. More resilient communities for what's already happening across the world. And so as temperatures rise, so do extremes, and I thought I would just point the example from this summer. So usually when we talk about extreme weather, we cover everything, and this past year was quite intense for Canada. We had everything. We had the Jasper wildfire. We had hailstorms in Calgary that caused so much destruction. And of course, we had a lot of flooding. So the flooding that occurred in Toronto did impact Hamilton as well, and areas of Hamilton and the GTA. And it cost almost $1 billion, just that big flood event. And it wasn't from one river overflowing. It wasn't a coastal flood. A lot of people think that if they don't live near a river or a coast or in a high risk area, they're not at risk of flooding. This is no longer true. Because of those extreme rainfall events, like the one that we experienced this past summer, we are all at risk of flooding occurring in our areas. And I didn't include it here because it wasn't part of this group, but Quebec shortly after, I think it was in August, experienced another extreme rainfall event that caused $2.5 billion in damage. And it isolated people from being rescued, from being able to access what they needed just from the amount of flooding that occurred. So when it happens, it can be very intense. So as I mentioned, as extreme weather increases, so do our costs. So this is what Dawn was referring to earlier. If you look at, so when we're looking at this graph, we're looking at catastrophic insurable losses. So this is how much insurers pay out when an extreme weather event occurs. And so this graph is from when it started being tracked. This is what we have data back to, and it goes back to 1983. And so you can see the bars are pretty low, with some intense events occurring, like the Eastern ice storm, for example, in '98. But once we cross 2009 and that gray area that you see, the average in catastrophic losses was about $2 billion, but now after we consider 2024, it's almost $3 billion per year. Before that, insurers were paying out about 400 to 500 million per year. These numbers, all the numbers I'm telling you, are all corrected for inflation, and they're all 2024 dollars. So when I refer to the years previous and I say that's 500 million, that's today's dollars. When I say that in last year there was $8.6 billion paid out by insurers, that's in 2024, 2025 Canadian dollars. It was the highest year with the most loss. And we've had years like Fort McMurray wildfire, which was the highest before then. What gets your attention about 2024 is that it wasn't one extreme event that occurred, but many events across the country, with flooding being the costliest and really impacting that cost. And I do want to point out that for an event to make it on here, it has to hit a $30 million mark. So anything below 30 million, which is still a lot of money, didn't make it on here. So the losses are even higher. What this graph is not capturing, but we really like to point out, and I hope you can see this clearly on your screen, for every dollar that insurers pay out, so of insured loss, there are about $3 to $4 that are paid out by the rest of us. So us as individuals, our governments, businesses, we're all paying a price that we don't necessarily see, and it's very difficult to put a price on. So that's from time lost from work, the effects that it has on mental health. So every time that somebody's evacuated, lives lost, of course, and loss that can't be recovered with insurance, and homes that are not insured. So we'll get into that next. If you do the math, that's a lot of money every year that we're losing. And again, this doesn't even account for the long-term effects of climate. So if we think back to 2023, when we had that extreme wildfire season, most of us were breathing wildfire smoke. It almost didn't matter where you were in Canada, that smoke got to you. We still don't really have a number for the cost that that's having on our society in the long term. All that to say, it's so costly. So if we want to reduce those costs, we really need to start implementing some of the measures that I'm going to be speaking about shortly. But that's the whole point of this, is to reduce that graph that we just saw and reduce our costs. So let's get into flooding specifically. As I mentioned, it's the most expensive, most common and expensive climate hazard that we have in Canada. It can cause residents up to $54,000 on average to fix their basement when it's flooded. And basements are the first thing to go in most areas, in areas that have basements. about 10% of homes in Canada are built in areas that are considered high risk of flooding, and therefore they can't be insured. So that's about 1.5 million homes in Canada. So this might include homes that we know are on the floodplain already, homes that are on the coast. So we've built our homes and our infrastructure and our hospitals and our roads, like the Don Valley, we've built them in areas that flood. So because of that, many people are uninsured at this point. Outside of that, a lot of people don't have flood insurance, that they might be eligible for it, but they might not have it because of that feeling that they might not be flooded. And of course, if more flooding continues to occur, we run the risk of either premiums going up or more homes becoming uninsured. And this is both true for flood and for wildfire. Some areas in Canada are starting to see insurers pulling back that before the homes were insured, like some areas in Quebec. I'm not familiar with any areas in Ontario that happening yet, but we also know it's a lot more common for it to happen in the States. For example, large parts of Florida are not insured for flood because they just continuously flood. So we run a major risk here. And it feels like it's just the insurer's responsibility to provide insurance. But if we don't all do something, that whole society approach to reduce that risk, we all run the risk of our premiums going up and becoming uninsured. And again, all homes in Canada can experience flooding. So that idea that if we're on a coast or close to a river, we're at risk is no longer true. You are at risk. But because of those extreme rainfall events that can occur anywhere in Canada at this point, and because we've built over areas that would naturally absorb that rain, like marshes or wetlands, we are at risk of flooding higher and higher in our area. And another impact that flooding has that isn't quite captured by these graphs or these numbers is the impact that it has on the housing market. And so one of my coworkers did a study on what impact did flooding have on homes 6 months after they were flooded. So if they wanted to sell the house, how long did it take to sell? Did the price go down? And so she found that there was an 8.2% reduction in the sale price of the home for an area that had been flooded and it was known to have been flooded. And this is 6 months past the flood. It took longer to sell, so it was about 20% more days on the market. And there was a 44% reduction on the average number of houses listed for sale in those areas. So she found a pretty big impact, and this was done in 5 communities across Canada that had experienced flood on the housing market. I think if she did it again now, as climate events become more intense and the housing market is shifting, I think these numbers would be even higher. Okay, so that was all the bad news around flooding, but I have been hinting at there's so much that we can do. And I think this is where I want people, and at the Intech Center, we really want individuals to understand that they can help themselves, that they should feel empowered, that there's so much that they can do. Before I get into the Intech Center resources, the first thing that we can do is just vote for the change that we want to see. I say this in most of my presentations because a lot of people don't know how to get started, how do they get some of these actions to be implemented. It matters who's in government, your local government, so the municipal government, the provincial, the federal government, it really matters. Make sure that they align with protecting and making communities more resilient, and then it'll be beneficial for all. So it kind of starts there, but then there's so much that can be done at all levels. So this is a municipal flood risk checkup tool that we released 2024. So it is meant for municipalities. I just thought I would show it in case that anybody here has a connection or works in the municipality or knows of someone that could use this. It's a great tool for municipalities to determine how exposed they are to flooding. So that means, like, do people, does infrastructure, like, do roads, are they in the way of where flooding might occur? And then once they determine their exposure, they determine how prepared they are. So there are two levels of preparedness. One of them is just analyzing the risk. Like, do they know which areas are at risk of flooding? And do they know if they're at risk of flooding in the future, considering changes to climate that are still to come? And then the third part is, have they prepared by actually reducing risk? Oh, excuse me. And so they can go through a spreadsheet that takes about an hour to complete and just click off the actions that they have done. And then they'll get this like graphic at the bottom, which really shows them their areas of, this is like a sample of the results, their level of exposure and the level of preparedness. So if they get more green, they're doing better. And if they have more red, then there's a lot of work to do. There are lots of results that are shown on the scorecard, and it's really meant to help them to go out and implement some of these actions, or show it to council and get support for some of the actions that need to be implemented. And so from this tool, we created, and I've included QR codes all through this section because everything that we have is free, downloadable, can be given to anybody that's interested. We really want these resources to be used. So feel free to scan the QR code or contact me after, and I'm happy to send you all of our resources. They're all on our website. So from that tool, we created an infographic. We love infographics at the Impact Center, and we've started them really at the home level, but this is our newest one, which is at the community level. So I'll show in the next image a bit of a close-up for some of these. I realize this is quite small, but what we like about infographics is that it takes all of the work that we've done, all of the research that we've done, which we have had reviewed by experts across the country, and summarize it into a one sheet of what are the top actions that you can complete and how to complete them. And so if we zoom into some of these actions, just to show you, at the community level, for example, cities, and the city of Hamilton has some subsidies actually. If you're interested, they have them on their website. You can subsidize home flood protection measures. So for example, subsidize backwater valves or sump pumps or downspout disconnections. And so many cities do this already. Residents don't always access these subsidies, and I don't know if it's because they're not aware that they exist, or something's lacking there, but just know the city of Hamilton does have some. But again, our guidance is across Canada, so not all cities are doing this. For example, something else that cities can do is number 2, is assess how climate change will impact intense rainfall, river and coastal flood hazards in the future. So some cities have flood hazard maps, but if they only include the floodplain, like the current floodplain that they know. They don't include intense rainfall. So we don't know what would happen if an intense rainfall event occurs in certain parts of the city. And a lot of cities haven't really planned for climate change. So their plans include what happened in the past, and they're based off what happened in the past, but not really projections. So that's something that across Canada, we're seeing more and more communities try to implement with just different bodies that are providing grants and ways to do this. But cities haven't really planned for like the next 50 years or the next 100 years. And then the third one is, this is my favorite one. I kind of come from a background of like conservation and forestry and things like that. And it's to manage or restore existing natural assets to provide flood risk protection. So really conserving our areas that do a great job at absorbing that water, at slowing it down, cleaning it when it does come through, is our best flood protection when these events do occur. So this is very much at the community level. And without this, it's difficult, as much as we do at the home level, we really need that community level of protection. So again, that's where the voting comes in, and that's why I make the point as well. And so this was our very first infographic at the Impact Center, and it's 3 steps to a cost-effective home flood protection. I'll do the same. I'll walk you through some of the actions just to show you, but the idea behind it was, you have 3 steps. And so anybody can do these. The first step shouldn't cost anything, and you should be able to do it yourself or have someone in your family do it for you, a friend, if you need a little bit of help, but it shouldn't cost anything. The second step costs a little bit more, and the third step is more complex upgrades if you're planning to do them around your home. So for example, when we look at the first line, just removing leaves, and it's the second action from your east trough, that can already prevent water from going into your home. So I'll also kind of zoom into flood risk outside of the home and inside of the home. That's how I've separated the next two slides. So for this one, we're looking at things that can be done just outside of the home. So for example, taller window wells or extending the downspout up to 2 meters away from the foundation. I encourage you to go for a walk around your neighborhood and look at the downspouts. Drives me crazy when I see that they're all just falling right into the foundation or right into the driveway, and they're not going away from the home and away from the neighbor's home as well. And the last one here is, again, nature-based solution, is installing a rain garden for people that have a front yard or a backyard and have the space. Some cities have subsidies for these. You install a rain garden, they're much better at absorbing that water, cleaning it, moving it away from your foundation. There's a lot that can be done inside of the home. And here I included 3 different actions from that infographic, because the first one can be done by anybody. So whether you're renting your home, whether you live in the basement apartment or not, any of your valuables or belongings that you have at the lowest level of the home should at least be 30 centimeters off the ground. Most floods are less than that. So if you will prevent your belongings from being damaged by like minor floods. And then of course, bigger upgrades are installing a backup sump pump and a backup power supply. Just in case the power goes out, you want your sump pump to keep working. And installing a backwater valve. So some homes have them, some homes don't. Some of them you can easily install. So it's always good to check with the city or just check with a contractor to see if this can be done. But it's a great way to stop that water from coming back in through your pipe. Okay, and that's what I have for community and home. And then I thought, of course, we talked about insurance and touch on what insurers can do. So they can also provide incentives for mitigating our flood risk. So it's a different use of the word mitigation, but it's reducing our flood risk. So they can provide discounts or lower premiums if some of these measures are implemented. And I know that some insurers do. So if you have a backwater valve or a sump pump, you actually get a discount on your premium. So rewarding people for including their own flood measures is one way that insurers can help. And another major thing that insurers can do is public awareness. So run education programs, starting with their employees. Some insurers have like tens of thousands of employees, teaching their brokers about what's available, about what are some of the actions that people can do around their homes, so that their brokers can pass that on to their customers. And then passing that on to their customers as well. So we're seeing more and more insurers do this just because those costs of insurance have risen so much that we have seen them start education programs, start reward programs for communities and municipalities to do measures around their municipality, both for flood and wildfire. So they're playing a bigger and bigger role, but they can do so much more of this, of course. And so I'm finishing off with this point and this quote that I found after the major flash floods in Valencia in Spain this past summer, where we saw all over the news, all the cars piled up and that like brownish water and mud that ended up everywhere. And so a climatologist, Frederick Otto, from the World Weather Attribution, so she works in like the institute that determines how much climate change had to do with an event happening, and like they quickly tell us that data. She had this great quote, and she said, "Severe flooding is unfortunately inevitable. What isn't inevitable is how ready we are." And that just feels like exactly the type of work that we do at the NTAC Center. We'd like people to be more prepared for these events. We know more of them are going to occur. We can't signal to exactly where the next big flood will be, but we have everything we need to prepare for these events. We don't need to be victims of circumstance. Of course, a flood like this one, it doesn't matter how many downspouts you have pointing the other way, everything will flood, but many, many floods can be mitigated by implementing a lot of these actions. So that's everything I have for you today. I have one more QR code that just leads you to our website, but you do have my email now. And you can also ask Dawn after, if you don't have time to write it down. Please email me and ask me questions, or for our resources, I'm happy for you to use them. And I'm happy to take questions now. Thank you so much for inviting me and listening to me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bonada. I know there's a question in the chat already from Patrick McCauley, I believe. How much would damages be reduced if new buildings had no basements? A discussion is starting to break out, right?
Yeah, that's it. So it's been a conversation for a while now. Should basements be banned? And there are two reasons. One of them is the damage, of course, the costliness of the basement flooding. But the second more important reason is the amount of people that live in basements. So I live in Guelph, and when I first moved to Guelph, and we were a tiny new family, we went to live in a basement apartment. I was doing my PhD, and I wasn't doing it in this, so I wasn't aware of flooding. If I had known, I would have been terrified every day in that basement. As beautiful as it was, there was a little corner that was always a little bit moist. But that was my home. So when we talk about basement flooding, we think about how much it's going to cost me and it might damage my belongings. But for many people, they live there. So it's another level of danger. And we've seen in other parts of the world where they have flooded, many people dying, being trapped in basements. So it's a big one, and it's a big conversation that's been kind of going around. But I don't know a lot about like how the decisions are made around having, building basements. I don't know if that's something that will be banned anytime soon.
Thank you. Other questions that people would like to ask, and you can put your hand up and we can unmute you. You can unmute and ask the question directly, or you can put it in the chat. I would assume that there may be some other questions that have come up in the course of this excellent and comprehensive presentation.
I think also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sue?
Hi, yeah, I'm concerned about the impact on tenants. People who rent, and the cost. So, I mean, we know we have a housing crisis, to say the least, and the cost of renting is exorbitant. If landlords have to pay higher insurance costs, then in turn that's going to impact tenants. Has there been consideration around this at all?
Yes. So there are a lot of conversations depending on, I more relate to different cities and sit on different committees with different cities. And so, for example, I sit on a committee for the city of Waterloo, where they're exploring connecting more with landlords and getting them on board with some climate adaptation measures. Because the people that are affected are the renters and not necessarily the landlord, because the cost will just be passed along. So it's a big conversation. It's a big concern. I do think there's more that can be done around bylaws, for example. So the city of Hamilton was the first city to pass a bylaw about having a comfortable temperature in homes in the summer. So not just in the winter, which all landlords need to provide, but they also have to do that in the summer. And that took many years of advocacy, research, speaking for that to come through. I think with flood, it'll be similar. And I expect like once a major flood hits that affects more people living in buildings, or premiums going up and something like this happening, then we'll see that happening. But our society is a little bit behind all the time. Like events need to happen. It needs to cost a lot. People need to lose their insurance for us to act as a society on it. So I expect for something to occur eventually, but I think it will take some time.
Thank you. Jean?
I just wanted to give a personal support for all the downspout disconnections and the extendings and the water barrels and the rain gardens. And I think if people do that, I certainly found if I've done that and I escaped any damage during the heavy rain events in the summer. So you just have to, it's a cheap and easy way to manage your property and to manage your rain and to water your gardens. It's easy.
I like the cheap and easy because a lot of people feel overwhelmed right now. There's are so many competing priorities, higher price of food. Why am I going to be worried about my downspout? But it doesn't cost that much to do some of these measures, and they can prevent those smaller floods from entering your home and your basement. And we have a lot of people telling us those kind of experiences. It's a matter of awareness of looking outside and knowing what you can do. I think there are like two issues here. I think individuals are not aware of their risk, ignore it, don't think about it until it happens. And the second one is people don't know that there's so much that they can do, or that's so much that's available to them through subsidies, for example. So that's where we come in, where you come in, like in inviting me here to speak today. This to me is so important. It raises awareness and it brings that information forth.
I always make sure that I have garden tours in my yard because I'm a native plant gardener, and I always show people how this works. And it's cheap stuff out of home hardware. So I always try to support that for people so that they're not mystified by it. Or by the dollars.
Just showing someone, and if you have that opportunity, and people are not aware until you show them. So you should do a little video and upload it to social media if you want to be an influencer.
It's on the Hamilton Naturalist Club website.
Oh, there you go. We do have an influencer in the team.
Thanks so much, Jean. Not seeing anything, but I have a question for you for sure. You spoke about floodplains and the need to update the flood mapping. Is there do you have a sense of or knowledge of what is happening on that? I know that's largely managed by conservation authorities. Is there a provincial incentive to the conservation authorities to update their maps? Is this a municipal matter? How would that be approached?
It's a little bit mixed. So we're lucky in Ontario to have conservation authorities and conservation authorities that have mapping available. They are, some of them, going through the process of updating those maps. So some of the maps are quite old or not available to the public. So there is a process that's happening. I don't know how much the province is supporting that. I'm not sure how that's coming about and why, like which conservation authorities have the funds to do it and not, and why they're updating it or not. So I'm not 100% sure, but if you check with your local conservation authority, they might have flood maps available online, and they might be updated and might, this is the part that's like the hardest, that's not quite being done, be considering climate change. Flood maps, even if they're updated, they don't consider extreme rainfall. So that's what I mentioned before. So even if you look at the map and you determine that your home is not on the floodplain, that doesn't mean it might not flood. The only good thing about it not being in the floodplain is that you're at lower risk of insurance premiums, for example, going up for you, because insurers do tend to have the maps that they know, or at least insurers privately have maps where they think that the risk is for communities. But yes, conservation authorities would be the ones to go to. And nationally, for a while now, there's been a program for the national government to release flood maps. So they're looking for residents to be able to input their information into a portal, and then find out if you are in a flood prone on the floodplain. But that hasn't been released yet.
Thanks very much, Lucia.
Not really, Lucia. I snuck in on her
Jim's
on
got
her
his
account. Anabela, I'm about to move down into my basement. We've restored my basement, and my daughter and her family are moving upstairs, and we're on a slope. Basically, we're not at the bottom of the street. We're at sort of, elevated a bit. So in my situation, rain gardens and rain barrels? Would that generally do it?
So it depends on exactly what it looks like. A rain garden would help, but if it's a community level situation, so you should do as much as you can around your basement, your foundation, to be able to prevent that flood from happening. And I don't know if it's the same as like the question that you had in the chat, but there are things that are being done at the municipal level. So if the storm water system is kind of outdated in the area and an extreme rainfall event occurs, is it able to sustain any of the water coming through? Do you have nature-based solutions near you? So like, is there a nice forest nearby? Is there a river with enough area around it nearby that could catch that water? So it kind of depends on what your neighborhood looks like, not just your home in particular, but it's a good idea to implement as many of these measures as you can if you're planning to move into the basement. You're welcome.
Thanks. I'm seeing questions in the chat. I'm seeing a question about cisterns and can they mitigate the impact of flooding? And the role of wetland restoration in mitigating flooding.
So cisterns I'm less familiar with, but from what I understand, they would hold some water. I'm not sure how much water, and I'm just not as familiar with them. I imagine they would hold some. I just don't, it depends how big they are and how much of that rain is coming through. So I'm not totally ready to answer that one. But yes, with the other question.
Wetlands, the role of wetlands and the essential wetland restoration. The Hamilton Conservation Authority in our area is been constructing wetlands specifically with the objective of reducing flooding in Lower Hamilton and Lower Stony Creek, and the new wetlands are in Upper Stony Creek.
They play a huge role, and they're able to absorb much more water than our build infrastructure, and they're able to shift and evolve as we need them to. So we do need to see them as systems that are dynamic. So they, I think it's probably one of the best things that we can do at the community level, apart from having updating storm water systems, is bringing back wetlands. Ontario has lost about 70% of its wetlands. And so if they're around our built infrastructure, they're really good at soaking up that water. And we need to think about them as like being away from our home. They're still doing something, because then that water won't come down into our areas. So it's definitely a great way for us to slow down that rainwater.
Great.
If I could just jump in here on that one. It's wetland restoration, but also wetland preservation. Like we've got a couple of issues that we're working on. Like, for example, the AIMCO proposal to build warehouses on and around the Ghana Marsh, which is one of the biggest wetland areas in the GTHA, and you know, Hamilton 350 and other organizations like Stop Sprawl and Save Our Streams and so on can do so much, but the Intact Center and the insurance companies with the potential payouts, you know, what's the possibility of getting you know, people like yourselves and the insurance companies on board on campaigns to try to save these wetlands?
That's a great question. I can't speak for insurers. I do know some insurance companies support, for example, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which conserves or preserves private lands. So they purchase private lands, and then they're able to just completely keep building away from them. But they don't tend to be in like the middle of a city. They're kind of rural lands. So there are lots of investments from insurers going into those spaces that, like, they do it similar to us, like as a donation. I'm not sure what a center like mine can do, because we work for the University of Waterloo. So I don't know, I don't know how involved we can get with like the activist side of things, that I'm not sure, because it's not something I've explored with, like, what is the university stance on that? But we have the information about what can happen if you build over a wetland, and the risk that you're putting, that the building that they're building on there is at higher risk of flooding. So they're building in an area that is meant to flood. So we have all that information available, the costing of what a flood might cost, how much it costs to remove a wetland that could have slowed down a flood, that we're able to do.
Thanks. I see a question in the chat from Lucia. And let me just read it. I'm a part of Hamilton's Municipal Climate Change Advisory Committee, and our single policy for flooding in Hamilton is subsidizing backflow protection in basements. This doesn't seem appropriate to the scale of the issues we're facing. What do you think are the most important adaptation actions that should be taken at the municipal level today?
So this is the one that I kind of answered it when Lucia came on camera as well. So to me, the two biggest things that can be done, and I don't know if the city of Hamilton is already doing this or has plans to, are both the nature-based solution side. So just as you mentioned, like restoring and bringing and putting in new wetlands, but also upgrading stormwater systems. A lot of these systems were built before the 1990s, and so they just don't have the capacity to hold the amount of water that's coming down today when we do have these events. So those could be probably the two main but very costly adaptation actions that could be taken by municipalities. But I understand they're very costly, but there are more and more federal level grants that are coming down towards adaptation for municipalities so that they can apply to and implement some real action.
In Lucia's question, she said, our single policy for flooding is subsidizing backflow protection in basements. I do know from firsthand experience that we started to put in a rain garden last year, and we did get a grant from Green Venture for doing that, and we're going to do some downspout work as well, and that also is going to be covered under some new stormwater diversion grants this year. So I think it can be a little bit more than just the basement backflow.
Noticing on the chat again, Gail is pointing out that before she could get a permit for a basement suite, she had to deactivate the backflow valve. Does that make sense?
I'm not familiar with that at all, and I wonder if they gave a reason. I have no idea, because that might be some sort of safety concern, but that's not mine.
The reason they gave was that the tenants would not be able to clean and maintain the backflow valve because they didn't own it.
That's interesting, because
Even though it would be, their goods that would be damaged if there was a flood. Yeah,
one of our advice, and I think it's on the infographic, but if not, we have a report on like home flood protection, is to just clean it out and maintain it. So a lot of people are not even aware that they should do that twice a year. So that should just kind of come with the, like, if you're going to live here, you have to do that. So I'm surprised by that. That's interesting.
Other question related to some of the things that we talked about tonight. As Steve pointed out, a number of us are working on protection of existing wetland areas. Many of those decisions are, the City of Hamilton Council at this point is pretty much on board to try to do that. And we have agreed to, as a community, not to allow expansion of the urban boundary. But that is being overturned by new provincial legislation that allows developers to initiate their own urban boundary expansions. And in addition to that, we did a boundary expansion back in 2015 around the airport area, which is the highest point of land in Hamilton. In fact, the highest point of land between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And there are many wetlands and headwater streams and so on that are associated with that area. But these decisions look like they're going to be made not by the municipal council, but by the Ontario Land Tribunal. And so it would be helpful to at least get some argument base to go to the Ontario Land Tribunal or to be presented to the Ontario Land Tribunal. It would have to be done by the municipality because citizen groups can no longer get party status at the OLT. But some kind of a picture of what we're putting at risk when we demolish more of our wetlands, when we pave over more areas. The one that Steve mentioned, the Garner Marsh, is about a 75-acre property. They want to build 5 warehouses and parking for at over 200 truck bays and parking for over 1,000 vehicles. So it's going to be mostly impervious. And there must be implications that would apply. We could do a calculation of what that would mean downstream. And the creek that is affected there, Ancaster Creek, has lost 96% of its wetlands. It has very little left now. And the sort of tactic of how to approach that kind of thing, are there resources available or experts that we might turn to that would be able to help on that?
It's a super tough one because the best way to combat that is just to show the cost and the savings in keeping these wetlands. So in the long term, all of us understand it's a saving to keep them, and it has a return on investment because it can prevent other areas from flooding should we keep these wetlands. Showing that and giving the numbers when there are different players in the game and they're looking to increase housing or whatever the reason is for building over and changing what's already been determined by municipalities. It's like it's an uphill battle, but there is a lot of information out there on both the cost of not having a wetland, the savings from having a wetland. It's like the millions and millions and millions of dollars. Like this information is there. The Natural Assets Initiative does a great job of putting out these reports that say how much our natural assets are worth, how much they should account for in municipalities. And the climate, I forgot their name now, the Climate Institute, that's a federal level. They have a lot of reports on like the economics around adaptation. So again, like money saved for doing some of these projects. That might help, but it's a tough battle.
Definitely helpful. Thanks very much. I see in the chat, David McCauley has a comment. As an architect designing seniors housing, what further measurements would you suggest for senior housing to prevent flood damage?
It's a good question. So for senior housing, I would direct you to, we have one more infographic, which I can add in the chat, which would kind of apply. And it's based on like reports and other research, but the infographic just quickly shows what can be done. So let me just go to our webpage. It's key flood resilience measures for commercial real estate in Canada. And so it covers more like building level things that can be done. So I'll just pop it in the chat. That's the link. And so, you know, for example, where are the electrical systems placed in the building? If we're talking about like a building level, like when that's what I pictured when you said senior housing, where are hazardous materials stored? How is the elevator equipped to withstand a flood? Where do we have backup generation? So there are other things that can be done that are on this infographic. Yeah, so that might help with, again, for that type of level of building.
All right, Lucia, do you have your hand up again, or Jim? Is that Jim? Yeah, it's Jim again.
That is me, and I do have my hand up again. Anabela, I'm wondering, a lot of these wetlands that are being sort of attacked by developers are, they say they're going to make another wetland. They don't really know what the wetland is. They're going to make a stormwater pond and say that's the same thing as the Garner Marsh, which is a spring-fed marsh. And I'm wondering if there's a good source of information for how these different kinds of wetlands in quotes impact flooding and so on. Are there concerns of what, replacing a Springford marsh with a stormwater pond?
So there probably is a lot of research done on this, like, and scientific papers about the difference. And my very quick answer is they're not the same. So when we say, like, I'll pave over this marshland and then make another one, they're never the same, because even just from the animals that live there, the way that it was made, the materials that it's made, it's the same as, like, for me, when we think about planting like 1 billion trees, which is something that like the federal government had promised Canadians, but where are you planting them? What kind of trees? And that 1 billion isn't the same as like conserving a forest that's already, it's got like a heterogeneous, trees, that like different kinds of trees and different habitats and different things. So it's not one-to-one, I assure you that, but I don't have like that I know of right now to guide you and say, this is how you can use the resource that you can use to show that they're not the same.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sue.
Now I know Jim's still on. I just remember when my daughter had a flood in Burlington, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, they had flooding through the basement window wells. They had a fairly high piece of metal around and everything, but the ground leading up to it had not been put in properly. It's of paving stones and everything. And so it just flowed downhill. So that might be another thing that would be quite easy for people to do, is to make sure that where does the, put some water, is it flowing downhill towards it, and maybe grade away from the house. So I don't think you mentioned that before, so I thought I'd mention it.
It's on the infographic. It was just so small and
okay.
some measure. But
Yeah.
One of them is, but a big caveat is, do check with the municipality about the house grading, because we do have on there like grading around the land, to make sure. I can't remember the measurement right now, what the grading should be, but checking that once you do grading, it doesn't affect your neighbor. So it is a measure to be done, but it has to be in conjunction with like the homes around the area. That's an excellent point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you all very much, and thank you, Dr. Bonada, for a really informative and interesting evening. I don't want to